You're listening to Tune Dig, a podcast for music lovers. The premise is simple. We dig into an album to discover what makes it interesting, and then we dig into the crates for a vinyl copy to give away to one lucky winner.
Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter for more info about the album that didn't make the episode.
Today we're talking about Sunn's Black One.
If our podcast is about talking about music, and it's kind of about the way that me and you specifically talk about music. I specifically talk about this band in a really particular way. And so it makes sense to me to intro this band to anybody who hasn't heard of them the same way I would anyone else, which is I only bring it up if another human being is about to have the opportunity to see them live. That's the door. Any other, you might enjoy this album. That conversation never happens.
There is no strain of recommended if you like for this band at all.
Yeah, this would be a pretty wild stretch listening-wise. But in terms of the event of seeing them live, first of all, I think we'll find that seeing them live better aligns with what they're trying to do with live records anyway.
Sure.
And so in a way, they would love for you to just go experience them live instead of the recording only. But also because it's such a unique experience that I think it helps people really quickly understand Sunn in a way that's really tough to do contextually if you're listening to them. Like we were just joking about popping over to this special room here in the sound recording booth area just to listen to this record, just because we both know that it would sound the way it's supposed to sound in that room.
Loud and clear.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to replicate that otherwise. This is full on really good headphones or pretty much nothing.
I remember in college reading Theodore Adorno, like the kind of the first popular music critic, and he was from the school of thought that it was live or nothing, that any recording or reproduction of a piece of music was kind of a bastardization. And that seems insane now because that's the main way we consume music. But everything we know about the members of this band and the way that they're kind of high artists and the way they think of this as an experience more so than composition, the Theodore Adorno school of thought really tracks. And that is one of any number of music scholars that they would cite in describing their music. It doesn't sound like it when you first, like if you just play it through AirPods on Spotify, nothing about that translates. You really need the full, most possible range of listening capability to experience it. So we're going to maybe sound like we're right on the cusp of elitism this whole episode, but I'll say this as a preface. Anyone who's never heard of this band, I was where you are 10 or 12 years ago, and you were relentless in telling me how important it was that I see this band, that it was like some level you unlock in listening, and I thought you were full of shit, frankly.
Usually.
Yeah, right. You know, this was coming from a guy that had seen 311 like 15 times live at that point. So what did I know? But then they rolled through Atlanta. I'd missed them a couple of times. And then they rolled through and they played the Masquerade with Dead in the Dirt. And it was like an exceptionally dark, sort of cold night. And you were like, in 20 minutes, you're not going to be able to see the hand in front of your face. And again, I thought you were full of shit. And the fog starts and just keeps going for like an uncomfortably long time where you're like, they should probably cut the machine off. And then lo and behold, you can't see anything. And then the colored lights pop on. And then it gets so uncomfortably loud. And for the first 20 minutes, I hated you more than I've hated anyone in my entire life. And then my physical body just sort of died. It just sort of gave up. Like, I'm trapped here, and this is how it's all going to end. And this torture will be how I went out, say nice things at my funeral. And then all the weight just lifted, and it just became this heavenly thing. And like, I don't want to heap too much praise on it, but it was a truly religious experience. It was the closest thing to a religious experience that I think I've ever had in my life. And I was a believer after that. So if you're at a place in your musical life as a fan where you feel stuck in a rut, or you know there's something more out there to challenge you, look no further than this band. And if you really want to go all the way with this band, this is definitely the album to do it. So if I never thanked you, then just let me do it now.
You're welcome. I'm glad it panned out. This is a weird one if people aren't into it. It takes a lot of commitment. I'm glad you said we're probably going to sound like we're bordering on elitism, because I want to make it clear that this is not a inclusive and exclusive exercise, as in I challenge you to even be able to get into this band right now.
That's right.
But is instead an invitation to take it cautiously, because it's so much that's so different all at once. And I think, turning on, especially one of the records just prior to this, especially, you could probably get away with it with Monoliths and Dimensions, but if you turn on White 1 or White 2, you're going to get the wrong idea really quickly, and it's a lot. It ventures into the land of experimental in a way that is different than the way that Tago Mago or some other form of kind of progressive rock does. This starts way further out, but it's so worth it if you end up identifying with it when you're in the middle of it.
Totally right.
So talking about that concert experience, I think, is necessary to even talk about any album that's going to come out of this band, because there's a number of ways that that's true. One of them is, which I was amazed to find, when they record as a band, they record with their entire backline, which again is another aspect of when you see it live for the first time, you really understand.
That's an insane endeavor.
Yeah. This is otherworldly in terms of the specifications, not only of the amps themselves, but the size and pure quantity of them. But I mean, in the stage plot that this band has, and we need to talk a little bit more about how specific they have to be, but in the actual stage plot that they pass along that shows the venue, the inputs and everything else that they're going to require to play a show, literally says maximum volume yields maximum results on this piece of paper that people get, and it's an actual philosophy. The philosophy is going to sound like it's a Spinal Tap joke because a lot about this band sounds like it's sort of the beginning of a Spinal Tap joke. Unfortunately, or fortunately for people like me, they're really actually pretty serious about it. It doesn't mean that they're serious people.
Right, and there's a lot of context clues outside of the music itself that makes it seem like they're not, like the way in the credits, in the liner notes, that they give themselves all these stupid nicknames. And then very early on in the catalog, a lot of the song titles are kind of stupid. Like Halloween, and the O has the parentheses by it. There's a lot of like kind of frivolity in there where you're like, wait, what are they doing here?
Yeah, so it's everything that feels like it's going to be a joke, and instead it ends up being incredible, which is not to put too much onto it here, but that's just like how I wish life was more often.
Right.
This feels like a joke. Actually, it's an incredible spiritual experience that connects with me deeply in a way that I would love to take serious. So this band is named, including the artistic embellishment of their name, which you can't also pronounce, all in service of the amp brand Sunn, which was inspired in kind of like a through line with Earth using a lot of Sunn amps to begin with. Mm-hmm. And then so they were also from Seattle, especially the two main members of Sunn, which we'll talk about some more, Greg and Steven. So a lot of connection with the scene that Earth would come out of. And so it's also funny to hear them talk about how they became dedicated to that brand of amps early on, essentially because it was an efficient brand to like. No one liked Sunn amps the way that they do now, so they were talking about it was easy to go grab a 100-watt pure tube amp for $300,
or like less than that even.
Yeah. At a thrift store or something like that. Not a thrift store, at a pawn shop. There we go. Goodwill's never been that rad. And then they joke now that more people have paid attention to them, it costs 4 or 5 times that much. Yeah. So their whole backline, the whole stage setup, and the thing that they use to record are tens of Sunn amps for a band with no drummer. So you're not overcoming really anything with the guitar. It is really a ceremonial. I wouldn't call it religious in terms of their intention of it, because they never describe it that way, but they do describe it as ceremonial. And it's really interesting to hear them talk about over and over their approach to having a live show, to their approach to recording, and just the specificity with which they approach something that feels a lot more random and loose. When you first start listening to this music, it doesn't feel meticulous or even purposeful.
You're a little bit like, when does the music start?
Yeah, and it takes a while to come around to seeing how this was planned and how music gets written, and that there is in fact something called songwriting that does happen on records like this. It just takes place over a different scale than we usually think of music. Stephen O'Malley, especially, anytime you can read an interview from Stephen O'Malley, one of the guitarists here, it's worth hearing about his philosophy and the way that he approaches music and art in general. He's a relatively prolific person himself. But he talks often about how when you're spreading out the music as far as Sunn does, you're going slower. So there's less music happening over a wider amount of time. You spread it out and you begin to focus on things at a different level of fidelity. And he talks about how once you start doing that to both the rhythm, to the sound, to the tone, then minute changes that you would have never noticed in another context start to severely impact the music. And so that kind of diatribe, the way that we just got all the way here from trying to talk about all the pieces that add up to it, is like sort of the minimum you have to walk in with to hear them really slowly change notes in a song for the first time that you hear them and start to get along with what they're trying to present to you. Because it's an interesting form of meditation as music that's not really designed to be art for you to look at, but it's also not designed to be certainly catchy or hooky or have you experience music the way that you would like most other songs that get stuck in your head or that you experience on Spotify in a playlist.
You talked about Stephen O'Malley's interview. Like, there are so many good quotes from that guy. And he's also a great follow on Instagram because he's like always going to art museums and seeing natural wonders. And there's like there's like high-minded sensibility, curatorial type stuff happening in his brain all the time, right? So I think he perceives everything in the world around him as a piece of art in some way. So he just has a really interesting POV to me. But he said in one interview I thought was really interesting, inducing altered states is one of my main focal points. Everything is set up to shift your brain 20 degrees. I believe real passionate music can induce other states of mind. So it really is, to not harp on the meditation thing too much, it really is about mental transcendence and like having to push the boundaries further in order to get to that higher form of consciousness. And kind of like when your parents say, if I don't yell, you don't listen, the maximum results are really intended to be, it's extreme, but in a positive way, which is such an interesting thing because objectively it does not sound positive, especially on this record, but it gets you there. You know, it's all about a headspace. And I don't think anybody does a headspace quite like they do. I think they're truly one of the masters of helping you achieve higher consciousness through vibrations.
And literal vibrations, because that's one of the things you need to be prepared for seeing them live, which I think, again, is a reason you want to make a pit stop there if you can before really trying to understand the records. Because live, I mean, we're talking about shows that are being played at 125 decibels, okay? So by the time they crank up, and when I say crank up, by the time they like wind up a song, because it takes just as long as you would expect for them to really get all the layers in there. And once they
10-ish minutes, yeah.
Yeah. In which like that first 10 minutes, you can sort of try to keep track of time for a little while. And it starts to go away because it starts to get so loud that your body vibrates like in a way that makes you a little worried to begin with.
You for real feel it in your sternum.
Yeah.
Like that's when you start to notice, like, is this gonna be bad for me?
Yeah, and it's even for me, right? It's like one of those moments where you go, yeah, I know someone told me that this is the way it was gonna be, but it feels like maybe it's extra that way. You know? Like you get in the car with somebody and they said that they were a bad driver, but now you're on the wrong side of the road on the interstate.
Right.
So conveying the level of loud is really important because it's a different loud than the Who was.
It's lower.
Right.
The low end thing is really, really super important, which is an interesting through line from Tribe, who we talked about fairly recently. Low end was sort of their thing. And you think about the ways in which different frequencies affect our consciousness in different ways. And Q-Tip and Stephen O'Malley both inherently understand that and manipulate it similarly, but through very, very different prisms. But it's just interesting that they kind of manipulate the same technique.
So on top of vibrations, there's this extra level I want to push into just a little bit. You mentioned the kind of mindfulness aspect of the whole thing, and that's not accidental. Stephen O'Malley specifically in several places talks about the idea of active listening being a form of mindfulness, and that kind of active listening when it comes to music itself, or he would refer to it as deep listening in some places. On top of the volume and on top of the songwriting itself, you still have this layer that you need to take care of so that you can remove the extra senses that would be occupied by other things. So this band does not put on your traditional stage show. They are in black robes, sometimes doing virtually nothing, as you mentioned, with a ton of fog. So you usually can't see a lot anyway. Even when you can, there's not a lot of activity. And so it's men in robes in black against the backdrop of a bunch of black amps and cabs, usually against the backdrop of a non-lit part of a theater. They play in pretty unconventional places to begin with. So they're already trying to eliminate that extra thing that you might be looking for to help you exit that deep listening. So you're not looking at anything interesting. Nothing is really moving very quickly. And when they do, which I can mention my experience with it, including one concert in Atlanta later, when they do make you focus on something visual, it is extreme.
Yeah.
And it creates a lot of uncomfortable contrast with how you felt before. But they're intentionally trying to shift you into this alternate plane of mindfulness. Maybe even after listening to us talk about this band so far, seeing the album art cover, seeing the subject matter of the song titles, whatever, you're going to see a lot of death and darkness. I mean, this whole album is a mood, a very, very particular mood, right?
I saw the phrase infinite void used by them and others a number of times, and that's probably the best summation. Just staring straight with both eyes into the abyss.
They really tried to make you feel the darkness here. But usually that's associated with this kind of Alice Cooper level, like, I love the dark, I love Satan. I thought one thing that was really interesting that Stephen O'Malley talked about, he told a story of, they really enjoy hearing from fans. So they're not like hermits. They're not people who aren't able to talk or anything. So they're engaging with fans already. And he said that somewhere, I think it was over in Europe, he had some young fans come up to him and go, hey, we brought the Satanic Bible and we'd really love for you to sign it. And he kind of talks about, he kind of steps out of it and like gives you a view into how he was thinking about that moment, in this interview. And it's funny because of how passive he is towards the whole thing. And he talks about like, I totally understand why someone would associate our vibe with the Church of Satan. I'm not a Satanist. I'm not even very dark. And he kind of talks about it this way, like, I totally understand how people would take me wrong, but I'm not even offended by it. And, the interviewer asked, like, well, did you sign it? And he was like, well, they forgot it. But if they had it, I would have signed it because, and this is the quote that I thought was great. He said, if thinking that I'm part of the Council of Nine or whatever the fuck they're called is going to help your brain move into a different plane of reality, I'm all for it. This guy is willing to be associated with the authority figures of the churches of Satan in order for you to just have a good time listening to this, right? And it's like, think about holding that level of stuff.
The coolest dad.
Yeah. The most open hands possible. And so like that to me, that's a brief moment of what makes them special to me in like an earnest and genuine way is they really do want to move you into a positive experience, but they are willing and able to use darkness as the motif against which they give you that experience. And there's no contradiction there to them.
And this is the record, to be specific about Black One, that kind of got them pegged in that way. But I think it's interesting that in a number of different interviews, they have described this record as kind of a purging of early influences, right? They were flirting with and dancing around mostly black metal aesthetic and just kind of ideas. And they never really wanted to be associated with metal per se, just the heaviness that comes with volume and amplification and extreme philosophy and approach. They share that in common with metal, but that's kind of it. But then the other part is the pseudo third member of the band, Attila, having been in Mayhem, that sort of, it's a company you keep type of thing. But like with all their other collaborators, it's really a pure musical respect type of thing. I watched a YouTube video that was like 10 minutes long, and it just showcased his vocal range, which was not a thing I would have ever associated with a black metal vocalist. But the really, really low stuff in some places and then the really extremely high stuff in other places, you're like, oh, wow, he is super, super talented.
Yeah, their intersection with traditional black metal is
rad. Let's just say it. I feel like they do it right? Like it's just, they do everything but the posture, which is the opposite of what most black metal bands and people normally are. If there is one arguably objectively right way to do it, I feel like they did it from my perspective.
I wasn't brave enough to say it the way you just did, but I totally agree with it. Because, so a couple of examples here, which I think are really great, especially for folks, and I care a lot about this in a strange way, especially for people who don't have a base level understanding of black metal and its history and sort of have a cartoonish idea of the whole thing.
Also, I want to let people in on a little nugget of our friendship. Like, we could not be further on opposing ends of the spectrum about black metal just philosophically. Like, you are a staunch defender of it in most ways, and I think that's what you're about to get into. And I, 99 out of 100 times, think it is stupid, and I don't like listening to it. So please proceed.
Well, even more so than defending it in a direction or the other, showing the real like root level places where this intersects with that culture, I think shows you how doing black metal differently results in a really, really different outcome. Because in a lot of ways, their philosophy does align with traditional black metal philosophy. But what you won't find on this record is poor production on purpose, which was a staple of that scene. It was almost trolling on purpose, and they were making a point.
Wiz did it in the barn so you can feel the blood of the sacrificed animals. So hot, I need to take off my shirt off.
This will never not be associated with Metalocalypse to you. I get it. So speaking of Attila, Attila performed vocals for Mayhem. The rabbit hole goes deep on black metal history and this band's connection to it, because Attila, yes, was vocalist for Mayhem and became a vocalist for Mayhem after the vocalist for Mayhem, who called himself Dead when he was alive.
He made himself dead.
There you go. Committed suicide in like one of the most famous events of black metal history. And I don't want to go too far into that story itself, other than to say, if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's worth a Google, because that's a really fun story.
Watch until the light takes us.
That's a decent one, yeah.
Yeah.
So to have integration at those pivotal moments already is real. It's not just like a modern extension of that philosophy, but is real with the real people who were in that. And so,
I mean, it's kind of like Dave Grohl was like, I want to be in a band like Led Zeppelin. I should get John Paul Jones. This is a lot like that.
Wow, yeah. I wasn't going to try to make a connection to Led Zeppelin, so thank you. Thank you.
Says the guy literally wearing a Zoso shirt right now.
So Attila was a real part of that scene, and on top of having that, basis in reality for where that history and philosophy came from, on the other hand, one of the things that, speaking of getting pegged on this record, Black One was released on Southern Lord, which is co-owned and run by the two main members of this band, the people we've been talking about so far, Stephen O'Malley
and Greg Anderson, who we haven't really talked about, who I would like to talk about.
Right. So Southern Lord put this out, and so they obviously have control over their own press releases, which I think is an interesting part of a trivia kind of about this record in general, because now they sort of resent the fact that they gave away too much detail in a press release about this record, which I must read a couple of sentences just in general from a press release about a record like this.
Because the idea of doing a press release for now, like, who's the press, Like metalsucks.com, is there any... Where else could this have gone? Although this did get written up in the New York Times, and we should talk about that too.
Fake news. But But I mean, coming out of a press release are real sentences like, "Cry for the Weeper," and "It Took the Night to Believe" incorporate atonal melodic interplay within their massive skeletons, mammoth giants crushing valleys of the drowned. Listeners will still experience core Sunn recording fundamentals, like being completely overwhelmed by massive subsonic droning guitar riffs. But with Black One, Sunn takes it 10 steps below the others by intensely obsessing over making the overall ambience of this album as bleak, crushing, and devoid of light as only they possibly could. I mean, that's a fun writing exercise.
Hail Satan, where do I sign up?
So in this phenomenal press release, a little bit earlier in it, they talk about one really specific recording technique, which again ties back into black metal history. So Attila actually doesn't do any vocals on this particular record. So he was on White 2 before this, and then is like their default live vocalist, but didn't do anything here. But they did have the vocalist Malefic from Bathory. So in true black metal fashion, this is essentially a medley celebrating a band that one of the members of the band is in.
Yeah, that tracks.
Yeah, it does. But in the press release, they go ahead and tell you that the way that they recorded vocals, well, sure, let's just read it exactly as written here. For the epic side 4-piece, Bathory Erzsébet, which I have no idea how to pronounce and honestly don't care, Sunn procured a casket and then loaded it into a Cadillac hearse and locked Malefic inside it with only a microphone and a severe sense of claustrophobia. The result is truly suffocating and disturbing. The first time he performed with them live, they did in fact bring a casket on stage to honor his presence. And then apparently the power went out twice and Greg got drunk and mad and pushed PA systems down onto people.
Tight.
Yeah.
They also performed at an art gallery. They did a performance art piece where I think somebody performed inside a coffin, but the band performed also inside a figurative coffin. They like put them off in a corner where you could hear them but not see them. And the whole thing about the art installation was death. So it's just interesting how committed they are to that, like, go into the box thing.
But on top of it being cred, sure, it's also, there are some interesting details about it. Like, one is that even though this was a historic vocalist with a lot of cred in the scene itself, he had never actually recorded vocals inside of a studio. And so, yes, it's metal as hell to be able to say that you shoved him in a coffin in a hearse to record vocals. He also apparently was more comfortable recording vocals inside a coffin, inside a hearse, than he was inside of a studio.
That doesn't mean he was comfortable, though, as an intense claustrophobe.
Fair.
But that reflects on the recording.
Yep.
Because it's one of those things where, like, you can read it a bunch of times in the press clippings because as close to an incendiary, like, tabloid moment as this could possibly be, as underground as this thing is, this was, like, one of the things that all of the articles about the record talk about. But then you really listen to it and you're like, oh, that is as advertised. You can hear the horror in his voice. And there's a really good write-up of it by Ben Prescott, who wrote for Invisible Oranges. He said, to some extent, he's not performing at all. This is closer to audio verite of genuine suffering. Again, Sunn recontextualized black metal's harsh vocals into something stranger and more abstract. What follows is a sort of vocal field recording that exists somewhere between performance art and a nervous breakdown, backed by massive, dread-sweating drones. What's so unsettling about Malefic's vocals here is their lack of affect. He doesn't shriek or scream or project his voice at all. Rather, he moans and groans in a muffled rasp that sounds strained of any recognizable human feeling or emotion. What comes to mind is not so much a premature burial as a sort of living death, a consciousness that exists even after the body has expired. And so, as Black One closes, Sunn have taken their exploration of black metal aesthetics as far as it can go, past the grave, past death, and straight into the void.
Or that's just one example, too, of the level of collaboration that they have for the rest of this record. It feels surprising to know how collaborative it is, given how specific the direction of the music is. So I think it's really helpful to understand that, again, Greg and Steven are essentially the only constants in this, and everything else on other records, but especially on this one, are various levels of collaborations with other people, including, I mean, the first song on the album is like entirely credited to another person.
To Oren Ambarchi.
Right.
Who I didn't know had anything to do with this record. I've been a fan of over the past 5 years or so, just kind of in that, on the heavier side of that, like Tim Hecker, weird electronic, ambient, droney, experimental stuff, which has had a huge surge over the past 3 to 5 years. Had no idea that he's like a longtime experimental music scene person. And they got some people that are like long timers. So in addition to all the true black metal people, they got some amazing experimental and noise people like Oren, and then the person John Weiss on Cursed Realms. So like very carefully curated collaborators on this record, which is interesting.
Cursed Realms is a cover of a song by Immortal.
It's a cover in as much as a YouTube video of Justin Bieber slowed down 800% is Justin Bieber.
So sweet. You're finishing my sentences. Yeah, it's another good kind of triangulation point for seeing how they see and utilize black metal philosophy, and yet you can very clearly hear the difference between the original and this as a quote cover. And so it gives you kind of one more angle into one. I mean, I think it's worth it if you enjoy an aggressive style of music in general to go down various black metal rabbit holes as often as you can. Sometimes you got to come back out of them pretty quick.
I think it's very important to dig in and talk about the tracks of this record individually, because it's a record that's so easy to put on and leave on passively and just only really notice it with the parts that scare you or kind of seize your attention in some way. But each song has a really kind of distinctive flavor. If you listen really loud and you listen really presently, Cursed Realms is kind of one of the more extreme ones. One of the longest ones, so much so that I saw it described in one kind of track-by-track review as like, it has to be followed by Orthodox Caveman. I think it's good that Orthodox is in the title because it's the most kind of straight-up representation of what it's like to see Sunn live. It's the one that's the most like the stuff on the 2 White albums. Straight up, very loud sustains. But Cursed Realms is kind of an extreme one, even by this record's standards.
Yeah, they said that Orthodox Caveman was based on live material from when they had the White albums out.
That definitely makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, the songs are surprisingly complementary to one another in their quest to create real cinematics around darkness and around, again, death as a motif, not as a scary thing to throw in your face, but as an actual enveloping thing that you can hop inside of for a while. So we talked about opening track essentially being an experimental track, almost kind of auxiliary to Sunn at this point, or serving as an opening for the whole thing.
Definitely an incantation. I saw it described as opening a door into this world, into the void. If you're listening to it presently, you're definitely like, oh shit, something's about to happen.
And then that's something that does happen is It Took the Night to Believe.
Yeah.
Which is, I described to you, this is my canonical Sunn song.
Because it goes, wee. Yeah. can't hear that and not immediately think of you and all the times when we were like 18, 19 that you were like, dude. And I was like, I don't know, man.
They rarely start a song with anything close to an apex.
Right.
So this is already one of the rare ones that starts with a volume level so that you know what you're getting into, especially when you're showing somebody else. You're just like, hold on. I just seek to 10 minutes and 37 seconds real fast. But
yeah, the last song is just bells for 7 minutes, just a funeral bell off in the distance. And then right when you start to be like, is anything going to happen? It's like, whoa. So this is the opposite of that.
And this is the closest thing they have to a single. In that press release that we mentioned, they released this as a free download back when you still release things as free downloads.
Right. Put this on a mix CD for my girlfriend. Imagine that. It's like a Tim McGraw song, and then It Took the Night to Believe.
It does sound like a country song title, doesn't it?
Barbecue stain on my black robe.
So it might as well be canonical as far as they're concerned anyway, for at least for Black One in terms of being a representative part. So that song launches right into it. It contains so much of the tone that really is the thing that feels like home once you're in a live experience. There's a certain set of vibrations and hertzes essentially that start to set in as a bass, and that feels like one of them. So yeah, and also anytime we've talked about Sunn on this podcast, this is pretty much exactly the song that we've stuck in there for good reason.
For sure. I think the thing that if you listen to one song, I would say make it this song to decide whether you're in or out. You have the contrast between the Sunn thing, which is the very low, super low on the fretboard chord, very heavy sustain, all the amps at once. But then you have the black metal like tremolo thing happening kind of up at the top. And the only real sense of progression that you get for a little while, like they do that thing for long enough where you're like, oh my God, okay. And then they start to bend the low chord down, like they're forcing it, like they're putting kind of their shoulder into it. And that's when you're like, oh, damn. Like it's a small thing and you got to be listening presently to catch it because otherwise it still kind of sounds like the main thing in the background. But the first time you hear it, you're just like, oh, okay, all right. Yep, that's tight. That's a cool guitar thing. And they do it over and over again. It's very satisfying.
Very satisfying is understating it so much for me. Learning about the way that they collaborated for this record also is interesting in contrast to, for instance, they would later go on to do a record in collaboration with Scott Walker, who himself was a pioneer and a legend. And
R.I.P.
And so the story there, I think, is an amazing example, again, to not pigeonhole these people or this group into something based on kind of how you feel about their motif. So they themselves wanted to work with Scott Walker. They, I don't know, had their whoever try to reach out to Scott Walker, before you could just send a desperate Twitter DM to somebody. And, they never heard back, which they more or less expected. Apparently they got contacted years later because Scott had just started listening to their records, found out they had tried to contact them years ago and asked if they wanted to do something. The short version of the story is, they agreed to create a record together. The way that it sounded to Greg, who was describing it, the way it felt to them was, okay, we're going to basically be a backing band for a Scott Walker record, which they seemed okay with. So Scott Walker essentially records all of the vocals for the whole thing at once and adds his own scratch guitars and sends this file over and just says, write the music for it. These are my vocals. And so they do, and they make Soused.
As if after waving capon claws over ashes, a single talon should lower and silently plow. He carves the ghost mascot,
which is an interesting effort in and of itself, right? But I think some of the story that I never knew about it prior to now made it even more fascinating because it's certainly a different style of record, but they ended up being, credited as, an equal artist on the release, right? So it wasn't just a Scott Walker record, it was Scott Walker and Sunn. So it seemed like they were relatively pleasantly surprised about that. Sort of seemed like it didn't matter too much to them, but Scott Walker loved it and wanted to do it again. And they said no, because they felt that if they were really going to be co-artists on an album, they should write together. And if they're going to be a backing band, they should be the backing band. They want to do one or the other. They didn't really want to repeat this thing. And so it's interesting to imagine, one of the opportunities of your lifetime to go work with someone that you've always admired. It goes well enough, right? And then they say, do you want to do it again? And you're like, I'm going to pass. I didn't like the specifics of it, and we have a very particular way that we do things around here, so no thanks, legend. One thing about doing research about records, specifically for these podcast conversations, that has really blown my mind is learning about the different styles of collaboration that happen when albums are getting recorded. You don't hear about those details until you go looking for them. And to me, to hear about that level of we approach our music with specificity about how it gets created and who makes it and how. So the same band who can say, we're going to make vocals that essentially sound terrible and terrifying by locking someone in a casket to record them is also the same band that says, I don't totally like the nuances of how we're credited on an album versus our contribution to the music writing process. Like that both of those exist in the same world to the same people who are capable of making this sort of a environment and this sort of cinematic music around, concepts like bleakness and void and death. These people are rare in the world. Yeah.
You made the note about the breadth of collaborations that they've done, right? So just to run down that list, they've collaborated with a French choreographer and theater director, an American sculptor, an Italian performance artist, a Swiss art collective, a Belgian filmmaker. So very much in the vein of Can as well, who did scores for cinema, who had this diligent jam and be totally pure and then edit the actual recorded material in an interesting way, an actual artistic process about it. And the process was a creative medium just as much as the sounds themselves. That's a 1 in 1,000 or more type of headspace with thinking about music. And it can't be understated how much inspiration there is to be taken from a thing like that.
I want to tell a story that I feel like serves as an example of what you're laying out here and that level of commitment to something combined with them clearly having a clear idea of what they need to do to create the right context and moment inside of a live show. So they play at usually at non-traditional music venues. We saw them for the first time at the Masquerade, but that was actually kind of an unusual thing for them to do.
Well, a better example is we just missed them because we saw Dungeon Family at the Fox Theater. They played the same night through 3.5, 4 hours away from us in Tennessee in a cave, in a literal actual cave. That's a pseudo music venue, but it is underground and it is, again, inside a cave.
They actually have to vet venues from a technical standpoint because of the level of sound that they put out, their volume level itself, and then the actual frequency.
It's a structural stressor.
Yeah, so they have people who are in charge of ensuring that the buildings that they're playing in can actually handle the vibration of the sound, and they talk pretty often about how when they play in like old church buildings and in other cavernous places, that they'll often have a deep cleaning bill afterwards because of all the dust that'll shake out of the rafters. So they play in non-traditional venues. One of the last times I saw them when they came through Atlanta, they played in a place that kind of popped up as a venue and then went away. No one, even the people who were working there, really didn't understand what was about to happen. And so you're in an unusual venue in a place where instead of, being in a bar or something you'd usually be in to see a show like this, you're in sort of an event venue with people walking around with drink trays. And then Eagle Twin gets done playing and they start to fill up the venue with fog, clearly. And you're already starting to get some confused looks, right? Just like you mentioned earlier, it seems like they should really stop pumping fog at any minute now. And so the place fills up. They go on. one of the deepest joys in my life was the look on the faces of the event staff as the show began, because it was, I mean, just a real loss for words. What the actual hell is happening, because there are dudes in robes and lots of fog and some really weird lights. But it would only get weirder because the venue itself, maybe as a building, could hold Sunn and the sounds, but the fire alarm could not. And so the fire alarm starts going off and pretty quickly into the set. I don't know if they even knew that the fire alarm was going off, because yeah, you've got really loud noise, but you're also competing with really loud noise, and it's flashing the emergency lights to get out of the building, but so is the band, for the most part, flashing these weird, slow, kind of strobe lights in the fog. So it's kind of hard to tell that anything's happening at all. The event staff is not sure whether to evacuate the building or not. So there's this constant in-between of people not really understanding what reality they need to exist in, and then to just really keep pushing it. So already everyone is uncomfortable in their own unique way. That makes me comfortable. When other people feel all very strange all at once, that feels good.
And when other people, by contrast, feel comfortable, you feel extremely uncomfortable.
Right.
Thus is the Cliff Seal paradox.
So all of this builds up. The fire alarm's been going off for tens of minutes now into the set, and it progresses long enough for Attila then to come out. And again, I need you to understand that this was done with the straightest of faces, so to speak. There's no goof level about this show at all. Attila changes his robe into one that is entirely covered in shards of mirrors, and then brings his hands out in front of himself, and he's got a laser that shoots out of each individual finger of these gloves that he has on. So again, the poor event staff is already really confused, and now we've got a guy in a mirror robe with laser fingers who's really having a lot of fun pointing the lasers back at himself, because now they like reflect across the entire room in these really random directions because they're coming off of broken glass. And like, that moment was so Sunn to me. Like, it sounded amazing, it was enveloping, and it was so dramatically confusing to so many people who were within earshot of it. And you could be in it if you chose to, and you could literally disregard the fire alarms, the confusing staff, the possibility that the building may be burning down. You could ignore 100% of it and focus on this really ridiculous, overwhelming thing that was happening. And that, as much as I love concerts and as many of them as we go to, there is nothing that ever approached that moment in time and that ability to be enveloped in music from not only a sonic but also just a philosophical standpoint. Like, nothing matters except for this thing that's happening, and everyone throwing 100% of everything that they've got into it is so punk and yet so calm and adult. It was everything all at once. And so, you know, I always feel the weight and responsibility of telling other people about this band, because the worst case is you go to the show and you hate it. Fine. You can find a million things you hate. I'm fine with you finding out that you hate this band. I would rather you make sure that you don't love it.
Better to have loved and lost than to never have loved at all.
Or something.
I thought of that story and of you when I read O'Malley's interview with Wire magazine, where he said we played a show at all tomorrow's parties, and Attila and I had a 10-second talk about what he should wear. He never knows. He was like confused. I'm like, I don't know, man. Be a tree or something. I want to have trees on stage, giant logs, something like that. He's like, I don't know, man. He always brings the monk's robe as a backup, but he went out into the forest and stripped branches and bark off of an ash tree, and he made these sort of arm garments, this incredible mask and helmet and stuff. I was blown away. I was like, we'll be your druids, man. You're the holy oak. Do whatever you do. He's not afraid to let himself go and be metaphysical and be spaced out and think about things that are important, like ascending through the atmosphere or doing a track that's based around going to see megaliths in Lebanon. And then it says, affects Hungarian accent, because you'll never know where they come from, man. It's impossible to move them today. But he's right. I'm glad that after 25 years of making music, he's totally excited about that, and it's inspiring him. So this probably doesn't look or sound like inspiration that will jazz 98 out of 100 people that would listen to this podcast. But for the two of you, and for maybe hopefully a third and fourth person, I hope that a lifelong fan and a convert can convince you to push into new weird territory and like go out to the farthest part of the open world map musically and try this thing out, because it's such an incredible piece of art, and you'll never really know what you're capable of as a listener until you've tried what they've done here. Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter for more info about the album that didn't make the episode.